Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons functioning as a panopticon, okay? Deep subject here. Hold on. This is going to be a roller coaster ride. There's going to be some loops. We're going in a tunnel. We're going to shoot up high. We're going to go low. Hold on. All right. So, F. Wesley Snyder's Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen. Absolutely brilliant D&D canon hardback, all right? The D&D canon hardback, let's stop for a minute, all right? I don't think D&D canon hardbacks are written in English, okay? I think they're written in a new multi-layered universal language of meaning, okay? So F. Wesley Snyder, right? He comes to write Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen. It's not a normal writing gig. It's incredibly, and I'll tell you right now, okay? The people talk about this. They're like, hey, Hasbro doesn't really pay their authors very well. They're like, you're paid in glory, right? Like, you're honored to be an author on a D&D canon hardback. They should pay more money, and they shouldn't like let them be writing for a little bit of money and a bunch of credit. This is wrong. If you are a D&D canon hardback author, you are among like 100 people in the world who first of all, you can go into the tabletop role-playing game industry and spin up an entire, like, people will let you spin up entire tabletop role-playing games at companies just because you did one D&D canon hardback, right? Perfect example of this is Sean Merwin, right? He worked on Acquisitions Incorporated. He has a for realsy job with Ghostfire Games, right? It's his full-time job, right? And I'll tell you right now, I don't think for 1 second anybody hired him for anything but his D&D canon hardback, right? It's a very important, very real, significant accomplishment, and once you make it as a D&D canon hardback, you are among an elite group of tabletop role-playing game writers, and your work matters, right? At a level that other people, you could write entire series of tabletop role-playing games, and nobody will ever know your name, right? But if your name is listed as a key designer, as a designer on any D&D canon hardback, your name will be put into PhD, into doctoral theses tomorrow. Right, like it's a thing, right? Like it's incredible, right? So F. Wesley Snyder comes and he begins to write, right? But his writing he's just not writing an adventure, right? He's like, I have to meet the legacy of Gary Gygax, right? And Gary Gygax did this thing that's echoing through time. Every day, Gary Gygax screams from the grave, do this, do this, do this, and directs from his grave, his legacy directs Dungeons & Dragons, right? And this is why OSE is so hollow and so just useless husk junk, right? Like, and DCC and Pathfinder. It's why they're so meaningless, right? Nobody's shouting from the grave to direct these projects, right? Like, but Gary's legacy is, right? And Gary handed it off to Lorraine, right? And Lorraine handed it off to Lorraine Williams. Lorraine handed it off to Ryan Dancey. Ryan Dancey handed it off to Robert Heinzu. Robert Heinzu handed it off to Christopher Perkins. Christopher Perkins is now holding hands with Amanda Heyman and getting her ready to be the next design lead in Dungeons & Dragons, in my humble opinion. And F. Wesley Snyder understands that he cannot deliver an adventure like some piece of junk that sits on like that's something that would be printed for Pathfinder, right? Like he's just like Matthew Mercer. Like Matthew Mercer's like, oh, I need to bring the most transformative American fantasy story that's ever been built. I must abandon Pathfinder immediately and go to Dungeons & Dragons, because Dungeons & Dragons radiates awesome because it carries the changes Gary Gygax put into it. These fundamental echoing power changes, right? Like it's amazing, right? And so F. Wesley Snyder, I think he is consciously writing and he is subconsciously writing, right? And I think it is my humble opinion that F. Wesley Snyder included something in Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen that is fundamentally important and recursively looks back at Dungeons & Dragons itself within a D&D canon hardback and explains modern Dungeons & Dragons in Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen through Revel's End, the Panopticon. Okay, so now we reach it. All right, thanks for your patience. I told you we're going on loops right here. We're gonna stay with me. All right. So let's talk about the Dragonlance Panopticon. Okay, what is the Dragonlance Panopticon? Right, the Dragonlance Panopticon is Revel's End. Revel's End is a political prison in Icewind Dale, right, where they send political prisoners from the Lord's Alliance, which is this collection of cities within the Forgotten Realms, right? And Revel's End, this political prisoner, this prison for political prisoners, right, is, first of all, it's not a normal space, right? Like, already we're in a special space here. Revel's End is a special location within Dungeons & Dragons already, and a modern classic. It's already within Icewind Dale, the D&D canon hardback. It's now in Keys from the Golden Vault, and it's going to be in Dungeons & Dragons. And that's for the deep dungeon masters who are like looking deeply and like understanding that Dungeons & Dragons functions as literacy, philosophy, a little bit of science, like all these aspects of humanity's narrative structure, right? But it also is for the muggles, right? Like your mom's going to go see, and your dad, right? Who know nothing about Dungeons & Dragons might see Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves as like, oh, let's go see this. Like, there's nothing to see this week. We'll go see it, right? And they're going to encounter, Revel's End, right? Revel's End, this prison for political prisoners of Forgotten Realms, is a panopticon. What is a panopticon? A panopticon is a specific design for a prison, okay? And what it does is it puts a central guard tower at the center of the prison, and then it surrounds like 4, 5, 6 different levels in essentially a hexagon shape. It surrounds the guard tower with all of the prisoners' forward-facing cells, right? And so you could put one guard at the center, right? And that guard can simply turn around in a 360-degree loop every minute and see the status of every prisoner in the prison, right? It gives one observer 360-degree view of every single prisoner in the prison. This is what I'm posing to you. I think that F. Wesley Snyder is showing us, and I think he did this subconsciously, right? He's trying to match what D&D, what Gary Gygax did on Dungeons & Dragons. But F. Wesley Snyder doesn't understand what Gary Gygax did on Dungeons & Dragons. He just sees the effect, right? He's saying, I can't be a horrible, useless Pathfinder writer just scrawling another useless story, right? I have to say something that's meaningful, that will last for 5 decades and haunt people about meaning and purpose and philosophy. That's what Gary did, right? And what no Pathfinder writer has ever accomplished on anything, right? Because it's a hollow husk that's useless, right? So basically, he's trying to match Gary's energy, and I think he did it subconsciously, right? He puts the Panopticon, Revel's End, in Dungeons & Dragons, in Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen, right? And he's also at the same time saying, I have to leave Hickman and Weiss in the dust. I have to leave their prejudice behind. I have to leave their stubbornness behind. I have to surpass them, right? And so his subconscious mind is pushing him, right? And so the Panopticon is there. It's philosophy, it's art, it's passion, it's meaning, it's discussion. It's everything you need in a Dungeons & Dragons story that you will never find in Pathfinder, right? Like, because Pathfinder doesn't look for meaning. It doesn't look for purpose. It doesn't look to make people grow or learn or change. It's useless, right? Whereas Dungeons & Dragons can never be useless. It has to be written in this universal language of meaning, right? That has so many layers of meaning that they'll be unpacked for centuries to come, right? Like Gary's work. That's where we're at, right? So, F. Wesley Snyder, in my humble opinion, is stating that Dungeons & Dragons is the first emotional, intellectual, spiritual panopticon. And that when a dungeon master comes to Dungeons and Dragons, and when an engaged Dungeons and Dragons player comes to Dungeons and Dragons, something fundamentally incredible happens, right? They enter a panopticon, okay? What does Dungeons and Dragons allow the dungeon master or the engaged Dungeons and Dragons player to view? What are they able to view? They're able to view every emotion they have at the point of the game, for periods before the game, and periods after the game, after the session, after the campaign session, right? They can view every emotion they've ever had before, during, and after the session, the Dungeons and Dragons session. They can view every thought, every intellectual activity, every thought they've ever had. They can view it in 360 degrees, right? And then finally, they can view every moral act, the spirituality aspect, right? Dungeons and Dragons says, no, this isn't emotional and intellectual. We want you to think about alignment. We want you to think about your moral choices, your moral acts. Oh, and are you some godless atheist? You can forget that here. Gods are real in Dungeons and Dragons. That's why Dark Sun isn't reprinted, right? And they're like, yeah, all the realms have gods, and they're all real. So you can take your atheist noise and kick rocks, because that ain't going to fly here, right? And so Dungeons and Dragons becomes this emotional, it becomes the first emotional, intellectual, and spiritual panopticon. And Dungeons and Dragons puts us at the center and traps every emotion we've ever had, every thought we've ever had, and every moral act we've ever had, and allows us to view them, right? And then we can keep them in the prison, or we can release them, because we're the guard. Every word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking, subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.